to Nikolaj Gilbert, who's the relatively new president and CEO of PATH, but not new to partnerships. Nikolaj sort of sits at a number of intersection points here in terms of being involved in product development, working all across the world in terms of implementation of development, health programs, building capacity. So involved in a number of different sort of perspectives on this. And I'd be delighted to have you share with this group and our audience a bit more about what PATH has been doing over the last several months.
Thank you so much, Porter. It's a great pleasure to be here with such great colleagues. Yeah, we are a global health NGO with around 1,500 people working across the globe. And really, as you mentioned, we are working across the aspects from science to delivery. And if you work on all of those dimensions, partnership is really crucial to everything we do. So on the science piece, obviously work with some of the actors that has been mentioned this morning as well, CEPI, but we also work with academic institutions, research organizations to try to move the portfolio of COVID-19 candidates forward. We also work with organizations like Gavi to help with COVAX, setting up the COVAX, the ACT Accelerator as well. And obviously also with other important actors like CDC, Gates, and the whole private sector as well. So we really are an organization that is built on the foundations of partnerships and has always worked with private sector in moving science forward together with governments and public sector. On the delivery piece, we also work, and the planning piece, we also work with national governments to actually help them, together with them, develop national response plans for COVID-19 and in general, strengthen their health systems and capacity for laboratories, for example. So it's really, we are seeing, you could say, the benefit and the spirit of these collaborations across the spectrum. And that is really what has changed also in the COVID-19 response. I think now some of the challenges that we're seeing is on the manufacturing piece as well. We haven't talked so much about this yet on this call, but there is a huge need, obviously, to ramp up the manufacturing capability for the equal access to any potential vaccine. So this is really the angle that we are also coming into this and see how can we work with the actors to make sure that the investment, the funding gap is going to be closed on the manufacturing, on the science piece, as well as on the delivery and the distribution side. That is really crucial. So we are seeing, as I said, many of these complexities, need for partnerships, and really there is a lot we still need to get our head around to move this forward together. But I think the spirit is there, and look forward to speak more on this call on this together.
Thanks, Nikolaj. I'm going to turn next to Ben Hubbard, who's the co-founder and CEO of Parcel, a health technology solution company, but also now newly a player in the insurance market. So Ben, maybe you can tell the group a little bit about sort of the initial work of Parcel, the sensor technology that you've developed, because I think there are some good partnership stories there that Parcel had built with governments, donor governments, multilateral health agencies, foundations, et cetera. But most importantly, I think it'd be interesting for the audience to hear about the Global Health Risk Facility that you've stood up in partnership with industry, looking at the risks that exist in the supply chain in terms of global vaccines and distribution around COVID-19. We'll discuss some of this later on as well, but maybe you can provide an overview of Parcel and of the Global Health Risk Facility. I'll turn to you now, Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Porter. Great to be part of this. So yeah, we focus much more on the distribution aspect of this, and really a relatively invisible dimension, which is how we protect these vaccines as they're distributed around the world, protect them from loss. And so Parcel is a company, we're a technology company. We use low-cost sensors to monitor sensitive shipments as they're being shipped and stored around the world, including temperature-sensitive pharmaceuticals. And we use that data we collect to power cargo insurance products and better coverage, specifically for temperature-sensitive goods like vaccines. So as a result, we spend a lot of time working in insurance markets and specifically with underwriters at Lloyd's of London. Relevant to this discussion, we also partner with Gavi and monitor vaccine supply chains just as part of their routine immunizations, and work in a couple of countries now with expansions underway. And that actually put us in a pretty interesting position, theme of this panel being partnerships, just because we ended up talking to two pretty diverse sectors, that being global health and the Lloyd's insurance markets. And one thing you learn when talking to insurers, they generally hate insuring expensive temperature-sensitive pharmaceuticals, and they especially don't like insuring them going to higher risk, low-income countries. And so this is actually a problem we were working on with Gavi and others before the pandemic, because a lot of vaccines are not protected, insured, particularly once they hit the port of entry in a country. And of course, that's when the risk increases. So there's a reason, but that's actually when you want protection most. A lot of those challenges came down to visibility. Insurers weren't sure what they were insuring, what those conditions were, and started to see the data that we were able to collect at a granular level around what's happening to those vaccines. They could start to wrap their head around those risks. At the same time, it's still a lot of risk to take. And so what the pandemic did, like it did for everybody's efforts here, and in why crises can be great moments for innovation and acceleration, is we've been able to put a couple things together in what we're now calling the Global Health Risk Facility, which has been announced but not launched yet. It'll be coming to market in November. We have created a facility at Lloyd's of London with six and growing, 6 different insurance companies that will be sharing risk with development finance capital to help underwrite COVID distribution risks, as well as all other global health commodities, including that really important in-country distribution. So all the global to port of entry, and then as they're being distributed. And so we're doing a kind of public-private risk share. We're also using technology and data to give underwriters visibility into those risks, but also to give the owners of the products visibility so they can reduce the risk and improve these supply chains. And our hope here is actually to prove this market and make this one that insurers can more easily underwrite long after this pandemic is hopefully behind us. So yes, this will be launching in November, and is really just an extraordinary kind of combination of balance sheet capital from leading insurers like AXA, Ascot Group, and others, and all the global health partners we all know and love.
Thanks so much, Ben. Yeah, I look forward to coming back to you later when we're talking about the distribution side, just in terms of some of the specific risks that you guys see to the vaccines once we have them ready to go to market. I want to turn now to Jake with Celdara Medical and talk about another sort of dimension of partnership. So Celdara, I'll let Jake describe his organization, but has developed a unique alliance with academic institutions that are leading research on medicines and treatments, and fitting with that platform that Celdara has built over the years, launched a new initiative called the Pandemic Security Initiative in response to COVID to leverage that platform. So Jake, welcome, and we'd be delighted to have you tell us a bit more about Celdara's work, and particularly around the Pandemic Security Initiative.
Thanks a lot, Porter. So as you said, Celdara Medical is an accelerator, meaning we're constantly seeking out new science to develop into tests, vaccines, and therapies. And we find this science in the university system. Pharma and academia spend approximately the same amount of money on R&D every year, but they spend it in very different ways. And so the pharmaceutical industry is required by regulation to spend that money primarily in late-stage clinical trials. These are very expensive, very complicated, very necessary, but they don't generally result in innovative new products. What they result in is regulatory approvals that allow medicines to actually be used in the market. Academia, on the other hand, is spending similar amounts of money, but more on basic research, and this results in a lot of invention. And that invention, especially in the case of sporadic infectious disease, is rarely translated into medicines and tests. The reason for that is a very simple thought experiment. If we had a perfect cure for COVID-19 in 2018, you would have sold $0 worth of it, right? Nothing, because there were no cases. And so there really isn't a market for sporadic infectious disease. And then the question is, the innovation is there, the market isn't there. What could we do in order to address this problem? And clearly the scale of the problem is unique in human history. The response by our industry and by the NGOs and by the governments around the world has been astounding, what has been accomplished in a few short months, but it's incredibly hard to react while in a pandemic. And it's not a little bit hard. I mean, it's $12 trillion hard. It's 1 million lives lost hard. And so, as you mentioned, we are standing up a public-private partnership, the Pandemic Security Initiative, and the goal here is to prepare us for the next pandemic. Now, we do have COVID-relevant therapeutics. We have some immune modulatory drugs and other things that are potentially quite useful, but they're preclinical, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of money to move them all the way through to approval. And so what the Pandemic Security Initiative does is identifies, vets, and then selects the highest impact innovations that are out there in the world, and then develops them to a stage that they can be very rapidly approved by regulatory agencies for use in future pandemics. Because sadly, the only thing that's certain in all of this is that this is not the last pandemic we'll have to deal with. And so eager to tell the group more about the Pandemic Security Initiative later in the call.
Great, thanks so much, Jake, really appreciate it. And next I'm gonna turn to Michael Nyenhuis, the President and CEO of UNICEF USA. We've worked a lot with Henrietta Ford, the Executive Director of UNICEF, who's been way out in front among other leaders in the UN system. Their global call to action and humanitarian assistance. And UNICEF, I'm sure, is very well known by our audience, but touches so many aspects of response in terms of COVID-19. So in particular, we'll play a role around vaccine procurement and distribution, but also dealing with the food insecurity that Gargee referenced earlier in terms of spikes in severe malnutrition and that putting millions of children's lives at risk, dealing with water and sanitation. Also UNICEF's primary mission around basic education and how to keep children with access to education in a remote environment. So Michael, your organization that you support, UNICEF, has so many challenges that they have to respond to. And UNICEF USA is a large organization of itself, doing advocacy and fundraising. So I'd be delighted to hear from you about what has been the approach of UNICEF USA to this, and the extent to which you want to talk about UNICEF itself as well. That would be great.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to participate in the panel. I think I'll give you 3 examples of different kinds of partnerships that we're engaged in. I'm going to go to the education sector first, and then quickly to health, and then lastly in procurement. In the education sector, I was on a call today with our team in South Sudan, who are presenting an example of kind of the innovative education partnerships we put together, because 1.5 billion kids are out of school because of COVID, even in places like South Sudan. So we were talking there to a couple of students who are continuing their learning through a partnership that UNICEF put together with the Ministry of Education and local radio stations to do the distribution of curriculum over radio, because it's the most common form of media in some of the poor communities there. So these kids are listening to the radio, getting their curriculum, doing their work, and then able to hand it in too. So they're making progress there. So a really interesting way to use media and government and organization like UNICEF. And the second in education is partnership we have with Microsoft on what we call the Learning Passport. So we developed this Learning Passport to provide online curriculum for refugee kids who are out of their countries to be able to access their curriculum of their home country. And so we've been able to modify that to use it in COVID settings in a number of countries around the world as well. So sort of on the higher end with digital technology, giving access to students, but also using radio and places like that. On the health side, I'll just reference again what's already been referenced here, which is the Global COVAX facility, which UNICEF will play a really critical role in the distribution, in the procurement and supply of COVID vaccines when they're available to about 92 countries, low and middle income countries. And you probably know that UNICEF procures more vaccines than anybody for about half the world's children. So we have the infrastructure in place to be able to do that. So obviously a natural partner there, along with WHO and Gavi and Gates and the World Bank and others who've come around that. And then the third thing I'll just say is sort of the area of innovative financing for procurement. One of the struggles that UNICEF faced right away in procuring the PPE that was needed and that continues to be needed is despite our flexibility and nimbleness on the ground, as a UN agency, there's sort of cumbersome procurement regulations. And so at UNICEF USA, we were able to set up a couple of impact investing funds where we had investors come to us and put millions of dollars of invested dollars in to allow us to bridge the funding gaps between the need to procure and the ability to get that money into UNICEF from governments and from the World Bank and others, and to make guarantees to suppliers that UNICEF would pay. And we're able to use that impact investing money to do that. So just a different way to work with investors here in the US that wanted to play a role in this as well.
Great, thanks so much, Michael. And then our last panelist we'll turn to before we get into some of the other topics and just have a more free-wheeling discussion. So Dakota, who's the executive director of ID 2020, and I was reading up, Dakota, about the great work you guys have done in a number of areas advancing development and human rights. And for those who are not familiar with ID 2020 or the ID 2020 Alliance, maybe you can tell us a bit about the work the organization does around digital identity, how that ties into advancing sustainable development, and what in particular ID 2020 is doing in response to COVID-19 as it relates to your existing and new partnerships.
Thank you, Porter, and thanks to Concordia for bringing together such a remarkable panel. As I look around the panelists today, I think what's interesting is to see individuals representing every piece of the vaccine supply chain, vaccine value chain, from development to supply chain to delivery and advocacy. And unprecedented collaboration by many of the folks around this table, I think, has brought us a long way towards expediting and de-risking the development, production, and distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. And that's all good news. What is potentially less good news is that, vaccine development and financing, as so many have touched on before, is only one piece of the equation. We really need to think about distribution, and we need to think about distribution early. And what is less clear at the moment is how individuals will prove in a privacy protecting, verifiable, or portable manner that they've received a COVID-19 vaccine. My fear is that if we aren't able to prove who's been vaccinated, if individuals aren't able to prove themselves that they've been vaccinated, that the social and economic benefits could be limited. And paper-based vaccination records, the yellow cards that we've used, are prone to loss and misuse. They may prove to be the weakest link at the moment in this sort of effective and equitable delivery. But there's also incentives to falsify one's COVID-19 vaccination status in a way that I don't think we've ever seen with vaccination records before. And so with that, I think there's a really urgent need to reconceptualize the immunization record in order to ensure that an individual's vaccination status can be verified across institutional and geographic borders without dangerous incursions on privacy. And that's where digital ID technology comes into play. ID 2020, the organization I lead, is a global public-private partnership with a simple vision, which is good digital ID for all. And like Ben, we were working with Gavi on digital immunization credentials even before the pandemic. But the pandemic has brought a new urgency to this work. In the coming months and years, we expect that digital health credentials will allow individuals to prove proof of immunization records or their test results, and that will help facilitate the eventual return to workplaces, public venues, and global travel. The impacts of this when it comes to restoring global economic activity really cannot be overestimated. And simultaneously, we know that digital credentials have to be privacy protecting, user managed, and widely recognized and trusted in order to really benefit individuals. And I can come back to sort of unpack what that means later on in the discussion. But that building that ecosystem and driving critical mass around standards is really what ID 2020 is all about. Ensuring that we have a critical mass of partners who agree to the same technical standards so that these digital credentials are actually interoperable and actually recognized and trusted where somebody turns up, and that we are running the pilots, and again here working with Gavi and others, that provide the necessary data so that governments can confidently scale up and roll out digital immunization credentials as part of their pandemic response.
Thank you, Dakota. I'm going to turn out to the whole group and just pose a series of questions. So the first one, as I made allusion to at the outset here, is looking at sort of the current state of play in the research and development landscape. around vaccines and therapies in particular. And we made reference to the ACT accelerator. There are some goals associated with that, but in particular, 2 billion vaccines distributed by the end of 2021. And there are similar goals on therapeutics, et cetera. And so I'll open it up to the group. Let me just say, first, looking at where we are today, there's been a lot of excitement in the news. We've got 200 vaccines in development, 9 now that are in phase 3 trials, different timelines being discussed that are creating new confidence, influencing global markets. Maybe I'll start with a couple of our developers and ask Arpa and Dr. Feinberg, as developers of vaccines and therapies, what's your sense of sort of where we are today? What kind of expectations do we have as we look towards the end of this year and into 2021 in terms of bringing these vaccines and therapies to the market? Arpa, maybe if you want to kickstart, that would be great.
So I think the great news, and I think Mark also alluded to this earlier, is there's a lot of activity in both the vaccines and the therapeutic space, right? So there's a lot of players, a lot of partners engaging in the R&D efforts. And as Mark had alluded to, I think what we're all beginning to realize, whether it's from uncertainty around the actual clinical data emerging from the different trials, as well as manufacturing capacity constraints across vaccines, the more players we have out there, we believe, the more likely we will be able to answer this pandemic. So from a timing perspective, there's a lot of noise out there. I think everyone's seen different companies with different timelines. There have been some considerations for vaccines coming out as early as the end of this year. From a Merck perspective, we are looking more at 2021 from a vaccines perspective to ensure that we've got, if possible, a single dose platform so that we can address both the manufacturing supply considerations as well as the practical distribution and uptake of the vaccine. So our programs on the vaccines front have been very focused on trying to really get at that single dose effective and safe vaccine. And I may, pass it over to Mark to comment a little bit more about how we've been collaborating to make sure that it's more of a look towards what is going to make the biggest and the broadest impact across multiple vaccines versus, a race to be the first to get the vaccine out.
Yeah, no, thanks, Arpa. Just to build on those comments, which I completely agree with. We don't yet know what will be the pathway to a successful COVID-19 vaccine. I mean, it's really remarkable how quickly the science has advanced and how many really innovative and productive partnerships have come together. But, this is a new disease in terms of our awareness. Every day we're learning something different about it. And while we hope that a number of the vaccine candidates that are now in development will prove to be safe and efficacious, we don't yet know enough about this disease to know what is going to be necessary to do that. Also, we don't know whether some candidates will work well in some populations and not others. And we certainly need to address this at a global scale and generate data globally that will inform policy and procurement decisions, as well as drive momentum to support implementation. So there's, a lot of excitement, but there's still a lot of uncertainty. I think the next few months are going to be incredibly informative. But while we have things to be excited about, we also have areas that we need to be concerned about. And certainly in terms of the investments in research and development and ultimate procurement and delivery, they are woefully inadequate to meet the need. And others may wish to comment who have been involved in the ACT accelerator, but originally projected to need $35 billion to support work in the development of diagnostic test treatments and vaccines. Only about 10% of that funding has been made available. And while the COVAX initiative, I think, has been really an exciting, innovative approach and the most successful probably of the ACT accelerator pillars, there's a need for really sort of progress across the R&D portfolio, because we're going to need a broad-based response with multiple interventions to ultimately get control of this pandemic.
Thanks, Mark. I was going to turn to Nikolaj In reading up, Nikolaj, ahead of our session today, I was looking at some of past work in terms of an advisory capacity with COVAX, advising on manufacturing of vaccines, diagnostics. PATH has a long history in product development of dealing with issues such as tech transfers, looking at the capacity of local manufacturing in developing countries. So, I mean, that's a host of issues that I throw at you with the intention of, just kind of pulling you into the conversation to get a bit of your and past perspective on some of these challenges that we face that Mark was starting to allude to in terms of barriers to moving at the speed we want to around manufacturing.
Thanks, Porter. Yeah, I mean, the complexities are many. I think just to talk a bit about the COVAX as well. I mean, the vision behind COVAX is a brilliant one, right? That you are investing in a portfolio of candidates and together you have a larger likelihood of success of some of those candidates. So that philosophy is really in the spirit of, I think, what many actors in this space are working towards together. Obviously, when you launch something, a vision like COVAX, there are a lot of complexities, and one of those are, as was mentioned just before, the financing behind moving some of those candidates forward, but also on the manufacturing aspect. We know that the likelihood of bringing candidates forward, the probabilities of success for phase one to actually launch is in the single digits percentage, right? So, or even around 15% from phase one. So there is a likelihood that many of those candidates will fail that are currently there. But we are at the same situation where we need to actually beef up the manufacturing capacity, which is already limited from, you could say, existing vaccine manufacturing. And we did a study together with SEBI and Gates about the capacity around the world in terms of how many vaccines could be produced. And that was quite far off the 7 billion or more that we will probably need in the near future. So there is a huge gap in capacity. And obviously, if you add up the number of candidates that you have to produce up front, it means that someone has to make the decisions, which ones are you investing in to accelerate this? And that's really obviously a scientific discussion and decision criteria behind that. So we are in a situation where we have a lot of choices to make in terms of which of those candidates need to go forward. And also the capacity is not equally spread around the world. So here's where the geopolitics also comes in. So what happens to the manufacturing clusters that we have in China, in India, in Europe, in the US, and how is that going to be shared with the world? So the whole equal access question comes into mind as well here. So we obviously are trying to bring these issues forward, trying to help, trying to qualify more manufacturers to actually be able to produce vaccines. We have one candidate ourselves as well in collaboration with academic institutions. But on the vaccine manufacturing piece, this is really something that we are a bit concerned that the world needs to really get up to a gear and finance that soon.
Porter, this is Gargee. Can I jump in?
Please.
I just wanted to pick up on some of what Nikolaj was saying. I really agree that, we're in a moment where there is so much exciting innovation happening. We all want it to happen fast. We'll have very complicated decisions ahead about specific cold chain requirements, specific products and dosing schedules. Regulators and scientists will be helping us navigate safety and efficacy of products to come. I am really focused even more on making sure the kind of pooled approach to building out manufacturing capacity and the wherewithal to express demand for low and low middle income countries doesn't get neglected. We've all said, I think in the opening, that the fastest way out of this pandemic is actually not for those who can pay the most to have first and plentiful access to the product of their choice. It's actually a global and a globally rational approach to vaccinating the most vulnerable first, getting our economies and societies restarted. And so I think this COVAX partnership that does bring together the multilaterals, is working very closely with academia and industry. I think they've got a few very big, but a few very important jobs, helping us navigate access. So we have an agreed global approach to the allocation of new innovations, new vaccines, and know how we're going to do this. To fundraising, as Mark and Nikolaj and others have said, we have to make sure the market is there and ready to go. We know that industry is, and I hope will, make commitments to affordable access, and we will need to make sure the resources are there to purchase vaccines, and hence the goals we've set. Gavi is seeking something close to $6 or $7 billion for a COVAX purchase fund between this year and next year. And then we need to work on distribution. Ben said that, nobody likes to insure, but even distribute, vaccines at -80 cold chains. We have some experience from Ebola. This is an even more global distribution network we'll have to build. So, we've got the institutions that know how to do this. We need to sort of empower and support them to have the manufacturing and distribution capability in place.
Thanks, Gargee. Yeah, at this point, I'd love to just turn it open to others in the group who want to chime in on the issues around research and development, whether it's sort of state of play or barriers. So if anybody else wants to chime in, please do, and then we'll move on to our next topic. So I think, Michael, it looks like you maybe wanted to jump in here.
Yeah, I just want to make a point as we start thinking about distribution in particular, and I think this is really an advocacy point for all of those of us interested in the reality in places like South Sudan I was talking about earlier, that as we think about frontline health workers being among that first tier of people who are going to need the vaccine, that we remember that the frontline health worker in South Sudan or Malawi or in Bangladesh is equally in need of the vaccine as the health workers in the US and Europe and elsewhere. And just to really be thinking about the complications of distributing vaccine at that kind of cold chain to those sorts of places, but it has to be done because it's equally as important.
Thanks, Michael. Jake, did you want to comment?
Yeah, just a quick one, Porter. The complexities and the costs are astounding in all their facets, and they're really driven by this necessity that we do things quickly, by the fact that we're designing our fighter jets after the war has been declared here. And so if we prepare, we can reduce these costs by orders of magnitude by selecting those threats that are most likely to affect us in the future. And many of the people on the panel have been raising this alarm for years, but I think it is just now that we're starting to see the political will to change how we as a society, as a global society, think about preparedness and security. And so that's what I think the silver lining opportunity in all of this is.
Thanks, Jake. Maybe I'll just introduce the next sort of adjoining topic to this, which is moving from once you have vaccines and therapies that have gone to market, looking at challenges for distribution. And Gargee, you hit on some of the access issues, as have others. I would refer our audience in the Gates Foundation's Goalkeepers report that came out last week. There's an excellent visual of alternative scenarios. If the first 3 billion vaccines, if 2 billion go first to wealthier countries, what the reduction in deaths would be, deaths averted of 33%, versus if we take a equal access approach of those 3 billion vaccines, where you have 61% deaths averted. So there's strong data that stands behind a equal access sort of distribution strategy. But I want to come back to some of these as sort of structural and pragmatic challenges that we see in distribution. Ben, I thought of you again as we were just hearing about the cold chain, and maybe you could talk a bit more about, sort of what is the real risk that we see that these insurance products and facility that you described are being designed to mitigate.
Sure, I'm unmuted. Yeah, I think it's interesting just listening to this, because each one of these dimensions is critical and they all have to work for it to work, right? So we can come up with a perfect vaccine candidate, we can manufacture enough of it, we can distribute it really well, and then something happens in the last mile and it freezes or it spoils and it doesn't work. Or we do that part well, and to Dakota's point, we mess up the administration of it. And we can't keep track of who's gotten the vaccine, and we mess it up there. So they're all important. And, sort of my gaze has been on the distribution, because that's sort of the part, our little slice of trying to help. And, I think, as everyone on this panel knows, vaccines are very delicate things, and they do require near perfection in their delivery. And we can get it all right up until that last mile. That you were talking about, Michael, that the South Sudan case. And to Gargee's point, we're now talking about deep freeze vaccines, which would be such a failure, by the way. I mean, I think that's a real fail if that's what we end up with across the board. And so hopefully that's not the case, because that really will make access pretty limited in low-income countries. What's interesting about COVID is there's the element of theft. That's never been really a dimension of risk with routine immunizations, but there is that type of risk. There's misappropriation risk with governments even. We have all these air cargo issues around air cargo capacity. I'm sure people saw the clips from last week, around 8,000 767s required to move the product. And so all of that, it obviously makes this difficult. The good news is there's been a lot of work into and investment into improving these supply chains. Path being a real leader in the research and development of freeze-safe vaccine carriers and other technologies. A lot of people outside of global health don't realize actually the biggest risk to cold chain vaccines is not them getting too hot, but them freezing. From faulty fridges or these ice-cooled vaccine carriers. And so, our data, we now have lots and lots of data on vaccine conditions. In one country, we see there's a nearly 1 in 4 chance of a vaccine freezing as it makes its way just from the national level to an immunization site. The good news is, though, when we collect data, we know we can do something about it. So we found in that same case that actually half the damage comes from 5% of the refrigerators, and we know which ones they are, and we can replace them. We also found that moving vaccines twice as fast through that last mile segment, so less time in the last mile, can reduce spoilage by 40%. So a lot of this data can start to inform actions we take now. I think my biggest fear is we don't do enough right now to get ahead of the distribution challenge. It feels a little bit distant given all the other problems are so present, but there is stuff we can do now. And I do think there's there could be a tendency to overplan, overassess, lots of needs assessments happening now, but there's a lot of action that can be taken. And so, we're, obviously the insurance piece of this, it's one dimension. And I'd mentioned this global health risk facility we have, but we're excited about that actually because in the spirit of partnership, bringing private sector risk management capability to this task is really important. So we're partnering with AXA, the financial and insurance institution, but they have a presence in most sub-Saharan African countries, and they have risk engineers who can go out and survey warehouses who are experts in pharma cold chain. So trying to utilize that type of technical capability coupled with a protection from a financial loss to make sure that we're at least covering that dimension of it and doing it in a really data-driven way.
Thanks, Ben. Nikolaj, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, actually, to Ben's point, that this is why it's important that we have so many candidates in development on the vaccine side, because we might have successful candidates on safety and efficacy, but we also need to have candidates that can be distributed out in very hot conditions across the world. And some of those leading candidates that we see now actually has to be really deep freezed almost. So that aspects of which candidates that can provide that supply chain advantage or distribution advantage is very, very critical if we're going to work towards access to populations that are vulnerable, for example. I just want to make one more point, and which is when we also think about distribution, it's not only the supply chain issues and logistics, it is also how does that link to the national systems, the universal health coverage and primary healthcare in those countries? Who gets access to those vaccines that will be available inside the countries, and how is the political situation in favor of some population groups versus others? It's important that we hold our leaders accountable on a global scale, but also in country, I think, to make sure that that equal access is happening despite religion, despite, all the diversity that you have in a different country. I think that's a critical thing as well, on top of the more logistics or supply chain related issues.
Thanks, Nikolaj. Dakota, I would love to pull you in. I mean, we've been talking about how to administer the vaccine, which seems to come back to some of your comments at the outset. So on that topic, but also just to bring you back into the discussion, welcome your thoughts.
Sure. So I think two thoughts building off of comments from Gargee and Nikolaj and Ben and others. The first is that I think that there's there's opportunity in the midst of this crisis. I think Ben perhaps used that line earlier. But vaccine equity and ensuring that every child gets the full course of their life-saving vaccines is not a new challenge. We're certainly looking at it here and saying, how do we ensure that the correct individuals, that the allocation and distribution is fair. But we've been thinking in the global health community about how we ensure, that every child is getting every dose of their vaccines for a while. And one of the things that I think has emerged as being incredibly important in doing that is not only that children have vaccination records and hopefully digital vaccination records, but that they have proof of their ID, right? That there's some way of being able to know that, the child who's being brought in is the same child who was brought in last time. And the opportunity that I think I see is that the pandemic has offered us an opportunity to really accelerate investments in infrastructure, partially in health systems and certainly, causing tremendous damage to health systems, but particularly it's, I think, giving us the opportunity to accelerate investments in digital infrastructure. And there has, sort of wide variety of knock-on, benefits that we could see with really broad global, social development. And when we think about digital immunization records, the work that we've been doing over the last couple years with Gavi and with the government of Bangladesh has focused on, how do we ensure that kids have a portable user-managed digital immunization record, one that could move with them, whether there's climate-related displacement or to ensure that as they go to different clinics, that they're able to prove they are and receive that full course of life-saving vaccines. And so when I think about the need in this moment to ensure that we are rolling out COVID vaccines equitably and to provide people with some proof of the fact that they've gotten those COVID vaccines so that they can return to work and sort of return to some degree of normalcy. In doing that, we're laying that digital infrastructure. And if we can lay that digital infrastructure here, we can extend that digital infrastructure to children to ensure that they get every course of those vaccines. And we can do so to ensure that they have a digital ID and that ultimately that allows them to go to school, to open a bank account, et cetera. And so I think we, in the midst of all of this, do want to emphasize that there's real opportunity for us to invest in a future and to build a more resilient ecosystem.
Thanks, Dakota. Any other comments around the distribution side that folks wanted to bring into the discussion?
Yeah, I might just want to add on top of Dakota's comment, which I thought was really great, sort of an optimistic look about the opportunities here to build more. And this maybe goes back to your early comment quoting from the recent Gates report that we've lost 25 years and 25 weeks. I think that, the good news there is that that infrastructure that got us to where we were, 25 years of good increase, is still there. And once we're able to, fully utilize it to catch back up on the basic immunizations that the kids need around the world, that we'll be able to do that relatively quickly. Assuming we can solve this problem and potentially, as Dakota is saying, do it even better with some of the infrastructure that's being built.
Thanks, Michael. Maybe just another topic, then I'll add to discussion, which I think partly, Michael, you hit on earlier, and Gargee, you did as well, which is for the policy and advocacy dimension to this. And we've talked about resource mobilization, whether that's around COVAX, ACT Accelerator, some of these other platforms. The UN has been consistently updating its global needs assessment and had a humanitarian call to action, and has come up with specific numbers that are required. I'd be curious to hear from the whole group, but maybe in particular, Gargee, in your role at the foundation, how you guys are approaching policy engagement and advocacy around sort of the needs associated with COVID. And then Michael, knowing that UNICEF USA is a big advocate, to hear from you, and then Nikolaj as well, with PATH having an advocacy dimension to its work. To bring first turn to the three of you. So Gargee, if you'd like to start off, that would be great.
Sure, happy to. I think we've talked a fair bit about the resource mobilization and the coordination happening among the multilaterals. What we haven't talked about, but is just as, if not more important, is how countries are preparing for procurement, distribution, how low and low middle income countries are thinking about balancing both health and economic needs. And I think we are well past the days when a solution can be sort of baked in Geneva. And so we're really focused on how do we listen and make sure we're understanding what countries need and when. And in the therapeutics area, I think one of the most exciting innovations and partnerships has been the African Medical Supplies Platform, which is an AU initiated partnership that has helped stand up the digital and analog infrastructure to procure and distribute PPE, lay the groundwork for dexamethasone distribution in Africa. These are the kinds of sort of African-led initiatives we want to be working with. We want to make sure that part of what Gavi is doing is understanding really clearly what are the distribution capabilities of countries. How are we talking about shared financing? I know the World Bank has been working very closely with countries to prepare kind of economic recovery packages. So I think a lot of the most important policy work we're also doing is the countries where we are working.
And maybe I'll just add then, sort of in the advocacy space, that we're really concerned about sort of anti-vax movements and what that might do in this case. And we do know from our polio experience around the world that some of the toughest places to finally beat polio are where it's not even a distribution question, but it's a willingness of the population to take the vaccines. And if you look in our own country here in the United States, the sensitivity or openness to vaccines. I saw one study recently that showed that the percentage of people open to vaccines has dropped from like 92% down to 84%, just because of the anti-vaccine movement. So we really have to confront that with strong education and advocacy around the need for vaccine if this is going to work.
Yeah, and just
Michael,
to add to that, you see in the U.S., 1 in 3 Americans are hesitant to take a COVID vaccine, but when you start drilling down into different populations, that gap gets even broader and wider in certain sort of ethnic populations where almost half of the non-white populations are very hesitant to get these vaccines. So once you get through the challenges of the distribution and the safety and efficacy, there's a whole sort of public confidence aspect that certainly needs to be significantly invested in. agree with that.
Thanks, Arpa. Michael, I was going to ask you just very, very briefly if you wanted to touch on the UN's Global Humanitarian Response Plan, which has been evolving over the last several months, and sort of how that helps to funnel different donors together in a coordinated fashion.
Yeah, well, I think any of those efforts that are happening, we have a lot of experience in humanitarian response and understanding the needs for partners of all types working on the ground to be working together. I think there are models in the way that we've handled some of this before that can help here, and I think some of those efforts that are happening, at the UN level should provide some of the platform we need to really be effective in the kinds of partnerships we build. It's not new, this is the first time we've kind of done this kind of thing with partnerships. So I think if we build off that kind of experience, it should be really helpful.
Thanks, Michael. Nikolaj, I'd love to turn to you and get a sense of what are some of the issues that PATH is focused on in its advocacy work?
Thanks, Paul. I think on the UN, obviously it's, the response have not received the amount of money that was the ambition, and that's really a shame. It's not. I also worked for the UN in the past, so it's something that has been happening with many pledges. But I think the issue in broader fundraising and resource mobilization is that traditionally what we are looking at is the pool of money that comes from ODA budgets, so from national development budgets and bilateral donors. And that's a limited amount of money available for any government to support development work. So I think we need to change the paradigm here so that the money that becomes available for the COVID response are also coming from other, you could say, pockets of money from national financial budgets. And if you start to talk about, what is available at the G2 finance ministers meeting, I think that is starting to happen, that people see, okay, maybe there is a way that this is actually very linked to other national priorities than just development. So I think that's a discussion that will also hopefully free up resources for the global gap that we have been discussing this morning. So I think that's a really critical discussion. So on the advocacy piece, obviously this is something that we want to keep on talking about. We try to, together with many of the organizations on the call, to list those issues, bring those issues forward, talk about the manufacturing, talk about the science piece and the distribution piece, and that really our hope is that the whole aspect and the whole momentum around COVID-19 will be sustained long term, that also more investments will happen in national systems. Last year's call to universal health coverage, investment of this both from a national government but also from a global set of actors, and will be something that we will carry on going forward. I think that is really what we are hoping for and what we're trying to advocate for, this long-term response to global health and global health security, which is essential.
So
Thanks, Nikolaj. And yeah, please, Jake, just chime in.
Yeah, I'll just jump in here. Nikolaj, I think, is spot on here. And the only thing that I would take issue with is that hoping that we have a long-term forward-looking view, I don't think is sufficient. I think all of us on this call have to take action to ensure that while we've got the attention of not only our other citizens, but the politicians, while we have their attention, we need to be able to take those definitive actions such that we can prepare and be better ready for the next pandemic that comes. I think that is an opportunity that's in front of us. It's difficult to do this while we're doing everything else, but I have seen this happen many times before, and some of you have been involved in this, where as soon as things start to get back to normal, there's some other emergency that takes everyone's attention, and we find ourselves in this cycle another 5-8 years later. And so I think it's on all of us to make sure that we are setting in stone those long-term actions that you're talking about, Nikolaj.
Thanks, Jake. Yeah, we're at time now. It's about 7 or 8 minutes left, where we're just going to go around and kind of rapid fire, let you guys offer any final comments, anything we didn't get a chance to touch on that you wanted to share. So maybe we'll go in a different order. Dakota, I'll start with you. Just sort of any closing remarks or any point you want to make you didn't get a chance to earlier.
Sure. I guess just building off of Jake's last point, and perhaps my own, we have this opportunity at the moment to lay the foundation for sort of the next response and then build a more resilient way forward. And I think with that, it becomes vitally important that we're not thinking about short-term fixes. And so it's not enough to have, in my case, digital identity solutions rolled out that are, sort of immediately effective, but sacrifice privacy, or don't provide individuals with the sort of necessary protections. And so as we, and in the midst of trying to do a million other things, it's really important that we do take that long-term view in terms of what it is we're putting into place now, and knowing that it will persist moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Dakota. And Arpa, I'll turn to you.
Sure. So just to build on that, I think this long-term pandemic preparedness is critical across the entire value chain. We talked today about R&D, distribution. I would say there's opportunities in the regulatory space as well to ensure earlier and faster access. If we're able to bring a little bit more standardization across countries for both sort of product and manufacturing approvals. And then last but not least, as we touched upon, it's, the global public health as well as private sector working together across every single piece of this pandemic preparedness is going to be important for the here and now, as well as in the future.
Thanks so much, Arpa. Turn to Ben next.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think just to echo these points, this is, the optimist in me wants to believe that we can come out of this stronger. And I think this is an opportunity to shake off some of the barnacles and bromides of sort of conventional approaches and some of the top-down way that development has been done. We've all sort of been a part of that and experienced it. So I think this is an opportunity to bring in the private sector. It's an opportunity to include countries as owners of this solution much earlier on than may be typical. And I think when it comes to distribution, look, the private sector does this pretty well. They're not perfect, but I think this is an opportunity to leverage some resources that have been sitting on the sidelines when it comes to global health for too long, and start to put them to use.
Thanks, Ben. And next, I'll turn to Gargee.
Sure, thanks. I can pick up the gauntlet on ending on an optimistic note. So we've talked a lot about needing global collaboration. Today was the day for a first indication of definitive intent to purchase COVID vaccine through COVAX. It was super important because we need both high-income countries and low and low-middle-income countries to pool demand, commit to coordinate, and we got a really great response. 64 high-income countries joined today, and so that means about 2/3 of the world's population is ready to procure through a COVAX pooled purchasing fund.
Great, thanks so much, Gargee. And I'll turn to Mark.
No, I'd also like to continue in this vein. I think what Jake said is absolutely true. Historically, human nature is that once a crisis is passed, you forget about it. And even though you say never let this happen again, we tend to do so, but we're making incremental progress. I mean, it was the 2014 to 2016 Ebola outbreak in West Africa that really brought stakeholders together and gave rise to CEPI. And I think the existence of CEPI is one important enabler of the response we're having now, and that likely wouldn't have existed. CEPI by itself can't do the job. What's needed is really end-to-end collaboration of multiple partners. And one really positive thing about the current response is that many partners who never worked together before are now working together and building trust and gaining experience. Many sectors who didn't have effective collaborations are now partnering in much more effective ways. But I think it's incumbent upon all of us to sort of think about the science of the partnerships here and how we optimize that so we're better prepared for the future. And to do what Jake and others recommended is when this is diminishing or when it's over, we need to really sort of prepare so that this never happens again. And I think that's really a shared responsibility for all of us.
Thank you, Mark. Jake, I'll turn to you next.
Okay, thanks, Porter. I think in the absence of pandemic time pressure, we know how to do this development and distribution of tests and medicines We can more carefully define our target product profiles. So we don't require complicated cold chain. We don't require super expensive manufacturing processes. And we even have time to develop public confidence, right? We can even get over some of these acceptance issues if we have the time. And this is the sort of night and day juxtaposition that I like to take between preparation and reaction. And so what I really hope we can do together as a society, as a global society, is do exactly what Mark just said, which is insist that it be never again, and then take the definitive steps and make the investments and make the effort in order to be ready for the next time round so we don't end up with another COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you, Jake. And I'll turn to Michael.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just reemphasize again the social aspect of that. If you think about the vaccine, there's maybe 4 legs of that stool. One is the technical piece of developing it, one's the supply chain, one's the financing, and the 4th piece of it is this social question, the acceptance of it. And we need to be working on that one just as much as the other ones to prepare people to want it and accept it.
Thanks, Michael. Last but really not least, Nikolaj, turn to you.
Thanks, Porter. I think 3 quick things. So the spirit of collaboration that many of our colleagues on the call has mentioned, essential. Let's continue that for sure. Second one, investing in national health systems. I think that is really critical and for the long term. And then the third one, which is what Gargee also mentioned early, was the link between global health, poverty, education, the whole human capital aspect, climate change. Let's try to see if we can make those links now so that we can address all the social determinants of health also in the future. And now we have actually seen how it's so close together. So let's see if we can bring that into the discussion as well as we go forward.
Thank you, Nikolaj. And thanks to all of our session participants. We're ending right on time, which is fantastic. And you guys in 75 minutes have provided tremendous insight and information, a lot of optimism in terms of lessons learned and the way forward. And to the audience and to our session participants, just a reminder that this new Action Alliance that Concordia is hosting is a great platform to continue these discussions and this collaboration, in addition to all of the initiatives that we've heard about today. So you would be getting a roaring round of applause if we were in a room together with our audience, but I will just offer my singular thanks on behalf of everybody who's listening, to the session participants who did a tremendous job. I know how busy you all are. So thank you, and wish you success in the rest of your virtual UNGA week. And thanks for all of your work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Porter.
Thank you, Porter.